Eleanor Whitmore did not cry when the seventh man turned his back on her. She had already used up every tear she owned. She stood on that wooden platform in Silver Creek, Montana, alone in the dying afternoon light, while the crowd below watched her the way people watch something broken, with a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them. 7 times. 7 towns. 7 platforms. 7 times a man had looked at her and chosen to walk away. She picked up her suitcase with both hands, squared her shoulders, and told herself this would be the last time she ever let strangers decide her worth. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far Eleanor's story has traveled. Now settle in. This one goes all the way. The platform had been built for hope. That was what the Frontier Marriage Program organizers always said when they set up in a new town. They called it an opportunity, a fresh start, a chance for hard-working women from the eastern states to find good men with land and means, and for men who had carved their lives out of raw wilderness to finally have someone worth coming home to. Eleanor Whitmore had stood on 4 of these platforms in the past 3 years. This was her 7th. She knew the routine better than the organizers did. The women arrived by stage in the early afternoon. They were given time to wash the road dust off their faces and change into their best clothing. Then they walked out onto the platform, one group at a time, while the men of the town stood in the street below and made their selections. It was orderly. It was civilized. It was, in Eleanor's private opinion, the most humiliating experience a human being could be asked to endure more than once in a lifetime. She had endured it 7 times. The first time had been in Cheyenne. She was 27 years old, newly arrived from Philadelphia, with a small trunk of belongings and a letter of introduction from the program coordinator. She had been nervous, but hopeful. The other women on the platform that day were pleasant enough, and Eleanor had told herself that the right man would recognize her for what she was: educated, capable, steady, and kind. She stood on that platform for 40 minutes. Every woman around her was chosen within the first 15. When the coordinator finally touched her elbow and said very softly, "Perhaps next season, dear," Eleanor had smiled and nodded and walked back to the boarding house with her head up. She had cried for exactly 1 hour. Then she had washed her face, eaten supper, and started making plans. That was the first time. By the 7th, she had stopped crying altogether. Silver Creek, Montana territory, in the summer of 1884, was not a beautiful town. It sat in a wide valley between 2 ridges of dark pine forest, and the main street was nothing but packed dirt and false-fronted buildings that had never quite finished pretending to be permanent. There was a general store, a land office, a saloon, a church under construction, and a jail that saw more use than the church. Eleanor arrived on the afternoon stage with 4 other women, all of them younger, 2 of them pretty in the conventional way that made men straighten their backs and remove their hats. She recognized the dynamic immediately. She had seen it 6 times before. She unpacked her single good dress, dark blue wool, well made, but showing the careful repairs of a woman who made things last because she had to, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the boarding house room and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She was 34 years old. Her face was round and plain with dark eyes that people occasionally called kind when they were being generous. Her hair was brown and thick, and she wore it pinned up because it was practical. She was, by any honest accounting, a large woman. Not merely stout, not pleasantly rounded in the way women's magazines sometimes celebrated. She was what people called, in the blunt language of the frontier, a big woman, and they said it the way they might say a horse was too old for serious work. She had heard it said about herself in every possible register, whispered with pity spoken, with clinical detachment, laughed about openly when people thought she was out of earshot. She was not out of earshot. She had never been out of earshot. "You look fine," she told the woman in the mirror. The woman in the mirror did not look fine. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the long stage ride. But Eleanor Whitmore had not survived 7 of these ordeals by being dishonest with herself. She had survived them by deciding every single time that the opinion of strangers on a street in a town she had never seen before was not the final word on who she was. She pinned on her best brooch a small silver thing that had belonged to her mother, and she went downstairs to join the other women. The platform was in the center of town, just in front of the land office. It was a raised wooden structure, maybe 3 feet off the ground, with a short set of steps at one end and a rope railing that had clearly been added as an afterthought. The town's men had gathered in a loose group in the street, some of them in their Sunday best, others in working clothes, all of them with the careful measuring look of men making a transaction they were trying to convince themselves was something more dignified than a transaction. Eleanor knew that look too. She had cataloged it across 7 towns, and God only knew how many faces. The coordinator, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Alcott, who wore a string tie and sweated regardless of the temperature, made a short speech about the program's values and the importance of mutual respect. Then the women filed onto the platform. Eleanor was the last one up the steps. She stood at the far end of the line, and she folded her hands in front of her, and she breathed slowly, and she watched the street. The first woman chosen was a girl named Clara, barely 20, with red hair and a shy smile. A broad-shouldered farmer stepped forward almost before she had finished getting her feet under her. He introduced himself, and Clara smiled, and just like that, the arithmetic of the afternoon began. Within 20 minutes, 2 more women had been selected. Eleanor watched each one go with the particular calm of someone who has already accepted the ending of a story before it begins. She was not without hope. She had been not without hope 6 times before this, and it had not served her especially well, but she clung to it anyway, the way a person clings to a habit that has never quite killed them. The 4th woman, a widow from Ohio named Margaret, who Eleanor had spoken with briefly on the stage and liked immediately, was selected by a quiet man with a dark beard who looked at Margaret the way men in novels looked at women. Like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world. Eleanor watched them walk away together and felt something she refused to call envy. It wasn't envy. It was simpler than that. It was the recognition of something she wanted and did not have, and the knowledge that she had been standing in the same spot, watching the same scene for 3 years running. Then there was one woman left on the platform. Eleanor had been in this position before. She knew what came next. Mr. Alcott would make a small sound of professional regret. He would say something kind and useless. She would pick up her valise and walk back to the boarding house, and she would sit on that narrow bed, and she would make a decision about what to do next. She was already running through her options. There was a ranch outside of town, advertising for a cook. There was talk of a school needing a teacher come autumn when she heard it. A sound from the far end of the street. Hoofbeats. A single horse ridden hard and then pulled back to a walk as it entered town. Eleanor did not turn her head immediately. She had learned not to make sudden movements when she was the only woman left on a platform. Sudden movements attracted attention, and attention from a crowd that had already made its collective judgment was rarely a comfortable thing. But then she heard a voice. Alcott. It was not a loud voice. It did not need to be. It was the kind of voice that carried without effort, the kind that had spent years cutting across wind and distance, and the general noise of men working hard in open country. Mr. Alcott straightened up like he'd been prodded with a stick. Mr. Carter, I wasn't expecting. I can see that. A pause. Is this the program? Yes, sir. Although I'm afraid we've just that is most of the ladies have already been. Most. There is one remaining yes, sir, but then the program is still running. Eleanor turned her head then because something in that exchange demanded she witness it directly. The man on the horse was not what she expected, though she wasn't sure what she had been expecting. He was somewhere past 40 broad, through the shoulders, with the particular kind of weathered face that came from years of working outside in Montana sun and Montana cold. He wore a plain dark coat and a hat that had seen serious use, and he sat his horse the way men sat horses when riding was as natural to them as breathing. He was looking at her, not at the platform in general, Not at the street or at Mr. Alcott or at the small crowd that had gathered to watch this unexpected addition to the afternoon's events. At her. Eleanor held very still. She had been looked at on platforms before, but always with the particular flavor of assessment that precedes rejection. That brief cataloging glance that measured and found lacking within seconds. This was different. This man was not assessing her the way a man assessed a horse or a piece of land. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then he dismounted, handed the reins to a boy standing nearby, and walked to the base of the platform steps. "Ma'am," he said. Eleanor was quiet for a beat longer than was polite. "Sir." "You're still part of the program." She heard the whisper run through the small crowd like wind through dry grass. She felt it too, that particular social electricity of a moment that everyone present understood was unusual. "I am," she said. "Though I suspect your question already contains its answer, Mr. Carter. Nathaniel Carter." She had heard the name. On the stage on the ride in the driver had pointed out the ridge to the north and mentioned Carter Ridge Ranch in the tone of voice people used for local landmarks. "Big operation," he'd said. "Man runs half the cattle in this part of the territory." "Mr. Carter," she said. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore, and to answer your question honestly, I'm not entirely sure what I am at this point. I seem to be the last woman standing, which is a position I've occupied before, and which I can tell you with some authority is not as triumphant as it sounds." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, something quieter than a smile. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. "This is my 7th program," she said, because she had decided some years ago that if she was going to be publicly humiliated, she was at least going to be honest about it. "I have been passed over on platforms in Cheyenne, Laramie, Billings, Helena, Fort Benton, and a small town in Wyoming that I have chosen to forget. I tell you this, not for sympathy, Mr. Carter, but because I believe a person deserves accurate information when they're making any kind of significant decision." The crowd had gone very quiet. She was aware of them the way you're aware of weather, not focused on any individual face, but conscious of the whole pressure of their attention. She could feel their collective bewilderment, that particular social confusion of watching something happen that did not fit the expected script. Nathaniel Carter did not look at the crowd. He kept his eyes on Eleanor. "That's a fair position," he said. "You mind if I ask you something?" "You may ask." "Why did you keep coming back after the first few times?" Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I refuse to let other people's lack of imagination define the limits of my life," she said. "And because I have a habit of finishing things I've started, and I had not yet found what I was looking for." He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was doing something complicated behind him, the sun dropping toward the western ridge, and Eleanor kept her eyes on his face because looking at the crowd was not an option she was currently willing to exercise. "What were you looking for?" he asked. "A partner," she said. "Not a keeper, not someone to do me a favor. A partner, someone who needed a capable person beside them, and was willing to see one when she was standing right in front of them." Something shifted in his expression then. She couldn't have named it precisely. She had become over 3 years and 7 platforms quite skilled at reading male faces, and what she saw in Nathaniel Carter's face was not pity, which she had expected, and was not the careful social performance of a man trying to be kind while being dismissive, which she had seen more times than she could count. What she saw looked something like recognition. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Not like this, not with—" He tilted his head slightly toward the watching crowd. "An audience. I'd like to request a proper conversation, tomorrow morning. The hotel dining room, if you're willing." Mr. Alcott made a small, strangled sound. "Mr. Carter, the program does have certain protocols." "I'm aware of the protocols, Alcott." He did not look at the coordinator. "Ma'am, is that acceptable to you?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She was not a fool. She had survived 7 rejections by being clear-eyed about the world and its habits, and she understood perfectly well that a powerful man asking to speak privately with a woman he'd just met on a platform was not an uncomplicated proposition. But she also understood that she had exactly no other options in this town, that the cook's position at the ranch outside of town paid poverty wages, and that Nathaniel Carter's expression contained none of the things she had learned to distrust. "Tomorrow morning," she said. 8 o'clock. He touched the brim of his hat, a simple gesture, nothing theatrical about it, and turned and walked back to his horse. The crowd exploded the moment he was out of earshot. She heard it as she walked down the platform steps, the competing voices, the disbelief, the laughter that was not kind. "Carter's lost his mind," someone said. "She must have said something to catch his attention," a woman's voice speculated. "More likely he just rode in at the wrong moment," a man answered. "He'll take one good look at her in proper light and think better of it." Eleanor walked through it with her head up and her hand steady and her valise in her right hand, and she did not run, and she did not cry, and she did not let her face show a single thing that the crowd could feed on. She had had a great deal of practice at this. She went back to the boarding house. She sat on the narrow bed. She looked at the small mirror, and she thought very carefully about Nathaniel Carter's face and the specific quality of his attention. And then she thought about what she would say to him in the morning. She did not let herself hope. Hope in her experience was a substance that required careful rationing. But she allowed herself something slightly different, a kind of watchful curiosity, a willingness to see what the morning brought. That night the boarding house filled up with the sound of other people's celebrations. Through the thin walls, she could hear Clara laughing with her new farmer, and Margaret's quiet, pleased voice, and the general noise of arrangements being made and futures being negotiated. Eleanor sat in the quiet of her own room, and she thought about 7 platforms and 7 rejections, and the way Nathaniel Carter had looked at her like she was something he was genuinely trying to understand. She thought about the word he had not used. Pity. Not once. She thought about that for a long time. The dining room of Silver Creek's only hotel, a narrow 2-story building that called itself the Grand Territorial, with a confidence its facilities did not entirely justify, was nearly empty at 8 in the morning. The breakfast rush, such as it was, had come and gone, and the room held only a rancher in the corner, working through a plate of eggs, and a young man near the door who looked like he was waiting for somebody. Eleanor arrived at 3 minutes before 8 because she believed in being on time, and she also believed in small advantages. Nathaniel Carter arrived at exactly 8, which told her something. He had changed his coat. It was still plain and dark, but cleaner, and he'd had a shave. His hat was in his hands. He saw her at the table and crossed to it without hesitation. "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Carter." He sat down across from her. The waitress appeared, took their orders, and disappeared again, and then they were alone in the functional sense, no one close enough to hear, though Eleanor was aware of being watched from the kitchen door and from the corner table. She was always being watched. She had made her peace with that. "I'll be straight with you," Nathaniel said. "I prefer it. I'm not a man who goes around making proposals to women on platforms. I want you to understand that. I'm also not a man who has time for the kind of," he paused, choosing his words, "performance that usually accompanies courtship. I've got a ranch that runs 25 men and several thousand head of cattle, and I've been running it alone for 6 years, and I've come to understand that I've been running it wrong." Eleanor waited. "My wife died in 78, he said. "Childbirth, the child too." Something in his face closed briefly like a shutter. "After that, I didn't—" He stopped. Started again. "I've had women out to the ranch on a trial basis. 3 different times the last 3 years. Women who were looking for exactly what the program offers. Nice women, good women. What happened?" "They left," he said simply. "Carter Ridge is not a comfortable life. It's isolated. It's hard work. There's no society, no neighbors close enough to visit regular, no church within a day's ride. In the winter, it can be brutal. 2 of the 3 women I brought out lasted less than a month. The 3rd lasted through 1 winter and then told me she'd rather die in a city than live another year on that mountain." "I see," Eleanor said. "I'm not telling you this to discourage you," he said. I'm telling you because I watched you stand on that platform and tell a stranger the honest truth about 7 rejections without your voice breaking once, and I thought that is a woman who deals in reality. Eleanor set her coffee cup down carefully. You're not wrong about that. I also heard what you said about what you were looking for. A partner. Yes. Not a keeper. Definitely not a keeper. Something in his face loosened fractionally. I need a partner, he said. I need someone who can manage a household that feeds and runs for 25 men. Someone who can make decisions when I'm out on the range and can't be reached. Someone who can look at a problem and solve it instead of waiting for me to come home and tell them what to do. He paused. I need someone tough enough to stay. Eleanor looked at him steadily. And you think that person is me? I think you might be. I don't know you well enough to be sure. That's why I'm asking for a supervised courtship, a trial period. 6 weeks at the ranch with Mrs. Harding from the church as a chaperone before any formal agreement is made. That way, you see what you'd be agreeing to, and I see whether my instinct about you is correct. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Silver Creek was waking up. She could hear the street through the window, the normal sounds of a frontier morning. I have a question, she said. Go ahead. Of all the women you might have approached women younger than me, women this town would consider more... She paused over the word, then chose it anyway. Suitable. Why me? He didn't look away. Because every one of those women stepped off that platform already half convinced they'd found what they were looking for. You stepped off it like you'd just survived something you'd survived before, and were making a calm decision about what came next. Eleanor absorbed this. That's not exactly romantic, Mr. Carter. No, he agreed. It's not. I'm not offering you romance. I'm offering you a chance to be seen for what you actually are rather than what people decide you are on sight. The waitress returned with plates, and for a moment the conversation paused. Eleanor looked at her breakfast and thought about 6 years of a man running a hard ranch alone. She thought about 3 women who had tried and left. She thought about what she was being offered, which was not what women in stories were offered, and was not what she had once a long time ago imagined she wanted. It was something more complicated than that. Something that asked more of her. She thought about the cook's position at the ranch outside of town. She thought about the teaching job come autumn. She thought about the 8th platform which she had been telling herself would be the last. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks. As a practical arrangement assessed honestly at the end. Yes. And you'll tell me directly, no softening, no vague kindness, if at the end of 6 weeks you've determined I'm not what you need. You have my word on it. Eleanor picked up her fork. Then I accept your proposal, Mr. Carter. The trial, that is. The other proposal will have to wait and earn itself. He nodded. And that almost smile crossed his face again, that quiet contained thing that she was beginning to understand was as close as Nathaniel Carter came to showing what he felt. Fair enough, he said. What Eleanor did not anticipate, what 6 years of survival and 7 rejections had not quite prepared her for, was the particular cruelty of Silver Creek between that morning and the day she left for Carter Ridge Ranch. It was not a single event. It was accumulated. It was the woman at the general store who looked at Eleanor's purchases and said loud enough to be heard 2 aisles over that she supposed the Carter Ranch food budget was about to get considerable. It was the men outside the saloon who went quiet when she walked past and then started talking again quietly, just barely loud enough the moment she was almost out of earshot. It was Mr. Alcott who found her at the boarding house the second morning and sat across from her with his string tie and his sweating discomfort, and said very carefully that he wanted to make sure she understood that Mr. Carter was perhaps acting on an impulse, and that she might not want to build expectations that could prove disappointing. Are you telling me, Eleanor said, that you believe Nathaniel Carter doesn't know his own mind? Alcott flinched. I'm saying that men sometimes... Mr. Alcott, she said, I've been passed over 7 times on platforms organized by your program. I'm aware that my prospects are limited, and I'm aware of the factors that limit them. I am not building illusions. I am accepting a practical offer from a practical man. If that arrangement fails, I will deal with it the same way I've dealt with the previous 7 disappointments, which is to say privately and without anyone's assistance. Alcott had left looking relieved, in a way that embarrassed him. But it was the morning of her 3rd day in Silver Creek that she encountered something that stayed with her longer. She was coming back from the post office when she heard voices behind the land office. 2 women, their conversation carrying in the dry morning air, with the particular clarity of voices that have no reason to be discreet. "She'll last 2 weeks, one said, "if she's lucky." "Carter must have ridden in at exactly the wrong moment," the other answered. "Poor man. He's been out on that ranch so long he's forgotten what's available to him." "She's clever, I'll give her that. Getting herself set up before he came to his senses. Give it a month. He'll find a reason to send her back. A man like Nathaniel Carter doesn't end up with—" The voice dropped, but not quite enough. "With someone like that." Eleanor stood on the other side of the land office wall, and she breathed very slowly, and she let the words land where they were going to land. She had been prepared for this. She had been preparing for this specific kind of cruelty since she was 19 years old, and first understood that the world had decided certain things about her before she had a chance to show them otherwise. But knowing something is coming does not make it arrive softly. She stood there for one more breath. Then she walked around the corner of the land office directly past the 2 women who went silent with the sudden stillness of people caught, and she looked at them with the particular expression she had developed over years of practice, not cold, not angry, simply clear. As if she had heard nothing that surprised her, and nothing that would change a single decision she had already made. She said good morning, because she was not going to let them make her rude on top of everything else. Then she walked on. That night, in the narrow boarding house room, she let herself feel all of it, the week's accumulated weight of other people's certainty that she was a mistake. She sat with it for a while, the way you sit with a physical pain, not trying to talk yourself out of it, but not letting it run the whole territory of your mind either. Then she thought about what Nathaniel Carter had said, a chance to be seen for what you actually are. She thought about what that would mean. She thought about Carter Ridge Ranch somewhere up in those dark pine hills to the north, with its 25 cowboys and its hard winters, and its 3 women who had left. She thought about what kind of woman stayed. She already knew the answer to that. She had known the answer to it for years. She just hadn't found the place yet that needed it. She packed her valise the next morning with the same careful efficiency she brought to everything. She wore her dark blue dress and her silver brooch. She came downstairs at the agreed hour and found Nathaniel Carter's wagon waiting in front of the boarding house, driven by a quiet older man named Hicks, who nodded at her without comment and helped her with her bags. Mrs. Harding, the church chaperone, a solid woman of 60 with the expression of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by very little of it, was already seated in the wagon bed. She gave Eleanor a look that was more measuring than unfriendly, and shifted to make room. Nathaniel was not in the wagon. He rode alongside on horseback as he apparently always did, because men like Nathaniel Carter did not ride in wagons when there was a horse available. As the wagon pulled out of Silver Creek's main street, Eleanor did not look back. She had a habit of not looking back once a decision was made. She had developed it across 7 platforms and 6 years of starting over. And she wore it the way she wore everything she had earned, not with pride exactly, but with the particular quietness of a person who knows what they've paid for what they carry. The road north toward Carter Ridge climbed steadily through the pines, and the air changed as they rose cooler, sharper, carrying the smell of water and rock and something wild underneath. Eleanor sat in the wagon and looked at the country ahead of her, and thought very deliberately about nothing except what she was going to see when they arrived, one thing at a time. That had always been her method. She had 7 rejections behind her. She had 6 weeks in front of her. And somewhere up in the hills, a man who had looked at her like she was something he was genuinely trying to understand was riding just ahead of the wagon. One hand loose on the reins, occasionally pointing out landmarks to no one in particular, in the spare, economical way of a man more accustomed to being on his own than to having company. Eleanor watched him for a while. Then she looked back at the country ahead. One thing at a time, Carter Ridge Ranch appeared after 2 hours of climbing, and Eleanor felt it before she saw it, the shift in the air, the particular quality of silence that meant open space after the enclosed press of pines. And then the wagon crested a rise, and the whole operation spread out below them. She did not let herself react. She had made a decision 3 platforms ago that she would not perform emotions for audiences. Whatever she felt about Carter Ridge Ranch, she would feel it privately and assess it honestly, and that assessment would inform her behavior, not the other way around. What she felt privately was something she could only call respect. It was vast, not beautiful in any decorative sense. Nothing about Carter Ridge Ranch had been built with aesthetics in mind. Every structure existed because something required it. The main house was 2 stories built from timber and stone, functional and solid in the way of things made to last through serious winters. The barn was larger than the house. The bunkhouse beyond it could have held 30 men comfortably. Corrals spread out from the barn in 3 directions, and in them Eleanor could see horses, dozens of them, moving with the particular restlessness of animals that were worked hard and well-fed and knew the difference. Nathaniel pulled his horse to a stop beside the wagon and looked over at her. She looked back at him. "Well?" he said. "Well?" She agreed. "Questions?" "Hundreds, but I'll save them until I've seen it properly." Something shifted in his expression, that same almost smile she'd cataloged in the hotel dining room. "Fair enough." Hicks brought the wagon down the slope and into the yard, and that was when the second thing happened. The thing Eleanor had been expecting and had prepared for, and which was still as always slightly worse than preparation could fully account for. The men came out to look. Not all of them, and not obviously they didn't assemble in a line or anything so theatrical as that. They drifted. From the barn, from the corrals, from somewhere behind the bunkhouse. By the time the wagon stopped in the yard, there were perhaps 8 of them in various states of appearing to have business nearby, and every one of them was looking at Eleanor with the particular expression of men who had been told something was coming, and were now verifying the information against their own assessment. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance. She stood in the yard, and she looked at the men looking at her, and she let it run its course 5 seconds, 6, 7, and then she said in a clear, carrying voice, "Good afternoon. I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I'll be here for 6 weeks on a trial basis. I'd appreciate knowing who's responsible for the kitchen." Silence. Then from the back of the gathered group, a voice said, "That'd be nobody, ma'am. Last woman left in March, and we've been managing between ourselves since." "Then that's the first thing we'll sort out," Eleanor said. "Is there someone who can show me where things are kept?" There was a pause, and then a small, wiry man with a gray beard detached himself from the group and said, "I can do that. Name's Pete. I've been running the cook stove since March." "Thank you, Pete. Lead the way." She picked up her valise and followed him toward the house without looking back at anyone else, which was a calculated choice, not dismissive, not nervous, simply purposeful, the body language of a woman who had decided what she was doing and had started doing it. Behind her, she heard Nathaniel's voice, low and even. "You all have work. Get back to it." The sounds of men dispersing followed her to the house door. The kitchen told her everything she needed to know, and several things she hadn't thought to ask. It was large enough, and the stove was a good one, a heavy iron range that someone had maintained with the grudging competence of a man who resented the necessity. The problem was everything else. Supplies were stored with no logic she could immediately identify. There were 3 sacks of flour in different stages of use, none of them properly sealed. The salt barrel had a crack in the rim that had clearly been leaking humidity for months. The arrangement of the workspaces made no functional sense. Whoever had organized the kitchen had organized it for storage, rather than for cooking, which meant that the person doing the actual cooking spent most of their energy walking back and forth across the room instead of working. "How many men do you feed?" Eleanor asked Pete. 25 regular, sometimes more if we've got hired hands-on for a big drive." 3 meals. Breakfast and supper regular. Men carry their own midday out on the range. Eleanor opened 3 cabinets in sequence, looked at what was in them, and made a series of mental notes that she did not write down, because she had learned long ago that taking notes in front of ranch hands in the first hour communicated the wrong thing. It communicated that you were cataloging problems to report. What she was actually doing was building a plan, but that could wait to be visible until the plan was already half executed. The salt barrel's cracked, she said. Yes, ma'am. Been meaning to replace it. What about the flour? Why are there 3 open sacks? Pete looked faintly embarrassed. Different men been taking from whichever one was closest. Eleanor closed the last cabinet. I'll need an inventory. Not today. I want to look through everything myself first and get a sense of what's here. But I'll need it in the next 2 days so I can figure out what needs to come up from town before winter sets in. Pete looked at her with an expression she recognized, the careful recalibration of a man who had been expecting one thing and was getting another. He had been expecting she understood either timidity or bossiness. What she was delivering was neither. Yes, ma'am, he said with slightly more attention in it than the first time. Mrs. Harding, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway with the observational stillness of a woman accustomed to taking stock, said, I'll show you your room. The room was on the 2nd floor, clean, small, adequately furnished with a window that looked north toward the higher ridge. Mrs. Harding showed her the washstand, the wardrobe, the hook on the door, all of it with the economy of a woman conducting a practical tour. I'll be in the room next door, Mrs. Harding said, for the duration. Thank you, Eleanor said. Can I ask you something? You can ask. The 3 women who came before me. What happened to them specifically? Mr. Carter told me they left. I'd like to know why, if you know. Mrs. Harding was quiet for a moment, with the quality of a person deciding how honest to be. The first one couldn't abide the isolation, she said finally. Nice girl, young, needed company the way some people need air. 3 weeks and she was crying every day. I don't blame her. She paused. The second one had a different problem. She wanted to change things, the way the ranch was run, the way the men behaved, the way Mr. Carter made his decisions. She had ideas about how things ought to be done, and she pushed for them from the first day. The men dug in against her, and Mr. Carter Mr. Carter doesn't respond well to being told. And the third was a good woman, Mrs. Harding said, with something that sounded like genuine sorrow. Competent, steady. She lasted a full winter. A pause. But she and Mr. Carter never found common ground. They were polite to each other. Nothing more. She told me the week before she left that she felt more alone here than she had in her whole life. That she'd rather be lonely alone than lonely beside someone who couldn't see her. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. I see, she said. I'm telling you because you asked, Mrs. Harding said. Not to discourage you. You're not those women, I could see that in the yard. But you asked what happened, and you strike me as a woman who prefers the truth. I do, Eleanor said. Thank you. Mrs. Harding nodded and left her to unpack. Eleanor unpacked methodically the way she did everything, and while she unpacked, she thought about 3 women and what had undone each of them. Isolation, the impulse to reform, loneliness beside someone incapable of seeing her. She thought about which of those she was most at risk for. Not the first. She had made her peace with solitude years ago. Not the second. She had no interest in reforming Nathaniel Carter. She had seen nothing in him that needed reforming, and more importantly, she understood that a man who ran thousands of acres of Montana wilderness at 40-something years old had earned the right to run things his own way. The third was the one that gave her pause. She thought about Nathaniel Carter's face in the hotel dining room. She thought about what she'd seen there. Then she finished unpacking and went back downstairs to learn the kitchen. The first week at Carter Ridge Ranch was an education in the specific flavor of being tested by people who had decided in advance that you would fail. It was not overt. That was the thing about men like the ones who worked Carter Ridge. They were not crude about it mostly. They were watchful. They had a collective patience built from years of working in conditions that punished impatience, and they applied that patience to Eleanor with the focused attention of men waiting for a prediction to prove out. The one exception was Clay Dawson. Clay Dawson was the foremost cowhand on the ranch. He had worked Carter Ridge for 9 years, which was longer than any other man currently there, and he wore that history with the particular weight of a man who understood his own indispensability. He was perhaps 35, lean and dark, quick in the way of men trained to be quick, and from the first morning he had positioned himself as the natural voice of collective doubt. He didn't say anything offensive. That was the craft of it. He simply said things that other men didn't immediately contradict. Things like, "You'll want to know that we prefer our biscuits a certain way around here." This delivered with perfect courtesy on the first morning while Eleanor was organizing the kitchen at 5 a.m., and the hands were filing in for breakfast. "I'd be interested to know how," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Way Alma used to make them." A pause. "She was the second woman who came out. Good cook." "She left in under a month, as I understand it," Eleanor said. "I'll take her biscuit recipe as a compliment and her departure as useful information." She heard the sound of at least two men suppressing something behind her. Clay Dawson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am," and took his plate. She filed that exchange in the category of battles that are won by refusal to engage on the opponent's terms, and she moved on. The thing about the first week was that Eleanor did not try to make anyone like her. This was she had come to understand the mistake most people made when they were new somewhere and desperate to prove their worth. They performed warmth. They worked too hard at being pleasant. They bent themselves into shapes that didn't fit them, in the hope that fitting in would be mistaken for belonging. And people could always feel the performance it made them uncomfortable, and discomfort expressed itself as rejection. Eleanor did not perform. She showed up at 4:45 every morning and she made breakfast for 25 men, and she made it well because she was genuinely a good cook and had been since she was 12 years old and feeding 6 siblings in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania. She learned the supply situation with methodical thoroughness. She went through every cabinet, every storage room, every barrel in the cold cellar, and she built an inventory in a small notebook that she kept in her apron pocket, because information was the foundation of every decision she would need to make. She was respectful to the men, and she was not familiar with them, because familiarity too early was another error she had watched people make. Respect was the right distance. It said, "I see you clearly, and you can trust what I show you of myself." On the 4th day, the supply situation produced its first real test. She was doing her kitchen inventory when she realized that the salt situation was worse than she'd initially thought. The cracked barrel had been leaking not just humidity, but actual salt, and the quantity remaining was well below what 25 men needed through a Montana winter. She cross-referenced it against the flour situation and the dried goods, and came to a conclusion she did not like. She went looking for Nathaniel. She found him in the barn with 2 of the hands looking at a horse with the focused attention of a man diagnosing a problem. "Mr. Carter," she said from the barn door, "when you have a moment." He looked up. "Now's fine." She crossed to him, and she did not lower her voice, because the men in the barn were going to know whatever she said within the hour, regardless. And performing privacy when there was none was another kind of performance she didn't bother with. "The supply situation is more significant than I initially thought," she said. "Salt is critically low. Someone's been taking from the wrong barrel and didn't account for the leakage. We're also low on dried beans. The cornmeal is at about 1/3 of what we should have going into autumn, and there are 3 items on the standard supply list that haven't been ordered in at least 2 months. I'd like to write a full order and have someone take it down to town within the week." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "How long did it take you to figure that out?" 4 days. "The last 3 women," he said, "never figured it out at all. I was planning to do it myself next month." "Next month would have been a problem," Eleanor said. "Late September orders from this elevation can be delayed by weather. You want this order in by end of August." He looked at her steadily. "Write the order," he said. "Hicks can take it down Friday." "Thank you." She turned to go. "Miss Whitmore." She turned back. "Good work," he said. It was not effusive. It was completely direct, the way everything he said was completely direct. She nodded once and went back to the house. That evening, sitting in the kitchen, going over numbers, she heard two of the hands talking in the corridor, not quite low enough. "She found the supply problem," one said. "Yeah, I heard." "Clay's going to say she only found it because she was nosing around where she oughtn't." "Clay can say what he wants," the other man answered, and his voice had something in it that the first week had not contained. "She's right about the salt." Eleanor turned a page in her notebook and did not allow herself to feel anything about that conversation. But she felt it anyway. The second week brought the first real crisis, and it arrived at 3 a.m. in the form of Pete's voice outside her door. Miss Whitmore, I'm sorry to wake you, but we've got a situation." She was dressed in under 3 minutes, which was a skill developed by 6 years of being a person who was needed on short notice. The situation was in the kitchen, a fire. Not a catastrophic fire, it hadn't reached the walls yet. The stovepipe had been running too hot, and something in the pipe joint had given, and the resulting heat had caught the wooden bracket that held the pipe to the wall. Pete had been awake for other reasons, and had smelled smoke in time. The fire was contained to the bracket and a small section of wall behind it. But it was 3 a.m, and there was fire in the kitchen, and 25 men were going to need breakfast in 3 hours. Eleanor took in the situation in about 4 seconds. "Get water on that wall, not the stove, the wall. Someone go wake Mr. Carter. Pete, do we have spare pipe fittings?" "In the barn." "Get them. I'll deal with the stove." What followed was 40 minutes of organized chaos. Eleanor kept the stove banked low enough to be safe, while the pipe situation was assessed, directed 2 hands, who appeared in various states of undress, to manage the water and the ventilation. And when Nathaniel arrived, 3 minutes after he'd been woken, dressed in what appeared to be record time, she already had the immediate emergency under control, and was beginning to think about breakfast. "Report," Nathaniel said. She told him. Concise, clear, in order of importance. He listened without interrupting. "Casualties?" "None. Wall damage is superficial. The pipe fitting failed. It should have been replaced in spring. Pete caught it early." "And breakfast?" "Cold this morning," she said. "I can't run the stove hot until the pipe's fixed properly. Bread, hard cheese, cold meat. I'll have everything on the table by 6. Nathaniel looked at the kitchen wall. Looked at her. Looked at the men who were standing around waiting for direction that apparently hadn't come to them naturally. "You heard her," he said. "Fix the pipe. Henderson, get the fitting from the barn. Dawson?" And here Eleanor saw something cross Clay Dawson's face that was not quite what she expected. "Help Miss Whitmore move what she needs to set the table." Clay Dawson looked at Nathaniel for 1 beat longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "Yes, sir," and turned to Eleanor. "What do you need moved?" "The bread from the cold larder," Eleanor said, "and the meat box from the cellar." He moved without another word. At 6 o'clock exactly 25 men sat down to a cold breakfast that was better organized and more plentiful than any meal they'd had since March, because Eleanor had spent her cold hours productively, and because she understood that how you handled a crisis communicated more than 6 weeks of ordinary competence ever could. Nobody complained about the cold food. Clay Dawson, at the far end of the table, said nothing at all, which Eleanor was beginning to understand was its own form of communication from him. Nathaniel caught her eye across the room. She nodded and went back to the kitchen. That was the morning the ranch started changing its mind about Eleanor Whitmore. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But she could feel it in the way men said thank you, with slightly more weight behind it in the way Pete started consulting her before making kitchen decisions, rather than after, in the way the morning and evening meals became occasions, rather than obligations. It was the end of the second week when Clay Dawson finally said what he'd been building toward since she arrived. She was alone in the kitchen at the end of a long day working through the supply order adjustments that the pipe repair had necessitated when she heard his boots on the kitchen floor. She did not look up. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Dawson." He was quiet for a moment that had a particular quality to it, not hostile but deliberate. "You handled the fire well," he said. Eleanor looked up then. His expression was something she hadn't seen from him before. Complicated. as if he'd been holding a position for long enough that letting it go required visible effort. "Thank you," she said. "I want you to know." He stopped, started again. "I've seen 3 women come through this ranch. I've watched Mr. Carter try to make something work that couldn't work because the women who came weren't built for this. They were fine people, good people, but they weren't built for this specific life." He looked at her steadily. "I've been hard on you." "You've been testing me," Eleanor said. "It's not the same thing." Something shifted in his face. "The men are saying you're different." "The men don't know me yet," Eleanor said. "Neither do you, but I'll still be here when they do." Dawson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am," with a different weight than he'd said it before, not the clipped performative courtesy of the first days, but something that sounded like an actual concession. He left. Eleanor sat with that exchange for a while. Then she went back to her supply numbers. It was in the 3rd week that Nathaniel began talking to her. Not about the ranch, he had been doing that since the first day, the practical conversations about supplies and schedules and the needs of the operation. She meant something different. She meant the kind of talking that happened after supper, when the hands were in the bunkhouse, and Mrs. Harding had retired, and the house held only the 2 of them, and the particular silence of a Montana evening coming down around the walls. It started practically enough. He asked her one evening where she'd learned to run a household at that scale, and she told him 6 siblings, a farmhouse in Pennsylvania, a mother who'd died when Eleanor was 16, and left her responsible for the management of a home that didn't have much room for error. He was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said, "How old were you when you started the program?" 27, she said. "The first time." 7 years? He said. "Yes. That's..." He stopped. "A long time to keep trying," she said. "Yes, people told me so. Frequently." "I was going to say stubborn," he said, "in the best sense of the word." Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the table between them, not at her, with the particular expression of a man who was more comfortable with practical things than with whatever this was. "My wife was stubborn," he said. "It came out quietly in the way of things that don't come out often. It was one of the first things I noticed about her. She had a way of deciding something was going to happen and just continuing until it did." Eleanor waited. "She would have liked this ranch," he said. "She never got to see it. We were still building when..." He stopped. "You don't have to," Eleanor began. "I know." He looked up then. His eyes were direct and a little raw in the way of men not accustomed to this specific kind of exposure. "I never talk about her. I thought I'd mention it because you said you prefer direct information." "I do," Eleanor said quietly. "She died 2 hours after the baby came," he said. "The baby was a boy. He didn't make it to morning." He said it in the flat, careful way of a person who has rehearsed the words until they run without pain, which is not the same as the words actually running without pain. "I built this ranch after that. I didn't have anything else to do with myself." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not the performed version of it. The real version, short, direct, without embellishment, because she understood that embellishment cheapened it." He nodded. They sat in silence for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable. That was the 3rd thing she filed away about Nathaniel Carter, after the directness and the almost smile, that he was a man who could tolerate silence. Who didn't need to fill it with noise or performance. Who understood that sometimes the right thing to say was nothing, and the right way to be beside another person was simply to be there. Eleanor had not been beside many people who understood that. She found that she did not want to move. She stayed until Mrs. Harding's footsteps above them indicated the older woman was turning in for the night. And then Eleanor said good night and went upstairs and lay in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about grief and stubbornness and the particular quality of a silence shared with someone who wasn't performing anything. The 4th week was when Clay Dawson created his problem. It was not Eleanor's crisis directly. It was Nathaniel's. But it became hers, in the way that things in a shared household have a way of becoming everyone's, regardless of the initial address. One of the younger hands, a 19-year-old named Will Ferris, barely 2 months on the ranch, had made a serious error during the cattle management on the northern pasture. Not a malicious error. A young man's error, the kind that comes from moving too fast and not checking twice. Several head of cattle had gotten through a fence section that had been improperly resecured. The cattle were recovered. No permanent damage. But the time cost was significant, and Clay Dawson, who had been on that section, and whose job it had been to check Ferris's work, dealt with it by publicly and thoroughly dismantling the young man in front of 8 other hands. Eleanor heard it from the kitchen window. She did not go outside. But an hour later, Will Ferris came to the kitchen door, looking like a person who had been turned inside out and then put back badly. He didn't say anything. He stood in the door with the expression of someone who had nowhere else to go and had ended up here by the simple process of walking until he ran out of forward. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "Sit down," she said. "Have you eaten?" He shook his head. She put food in front of him, and she sat across from him, and she did not say anything immediately, because she understood that sometimes people needed the food first. When he'd eaten half of it, he said, "I made a stupid mistake." "You did," she said, "and you've been told about it in a way that was designed to make sure you remember it forever." He looked up. "Here's the thing about mistakes," Eleanor said. "You can make the same one twice and be a fool, or you can make it once and learn it all the way through and carry that knowledge for the rest of your working life. The mistake itself doesn't define you. What you do with it does." He was quiet. "Mr. Dawson was hard on you," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Was he wrong about the facts of the situation?" A long pause. "No, ma'am." "Then learn it," she said. "Don't collapse under it. Learn it." Will Ferris looked at her with the expression of someone who had been handed something unexpected. He finished his food. When he left differently than he'd arrived, still subdued, still carrying the weight of the day, but with a quality of forward motion in his bearing that had been absent before. Eleanor went back to her kitchen work. Nathaniel appeared in the door 20 minutes later. "I saw Ferris leaving," he said. "He came for supper," Eleanor said without looking up from what she was doing. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "That was good of you," he said. "He needed someone to tell him a mistake wasn't his whole identity," Eleanor said. "It took about 10 minutes. Another pause. "I should have done that," Nathaniel said. She looked up then. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and the particular expression of a man acknowledging something that cost him something. "You've got 24 other men and a ranch to run," she said. "You can't be everywhere." "No," he said. "But I used to be better at knowing when one of my men needed." He stopped. 6 years is a long time to be running something alone. Eleanor looked at him. There was something in his face that she had not seen there before. Something unguarded in a way that she was beginning to understand was rare for him. That Nathaniel Carter was under the competence and the directness and the controlled quiet, a man who had been managing a very large and very solitary grief for a very long time, and who had somewhere along the line begun to manage it by contracting himself, narrowing down to what was essential, what was functional, what could be maintained without cost. The ranch ran, the cattle were managed, the men were employed and fed and directed, everything necessary was in order, and he was in the way the third woman had described from the other direction, profoundly alone inside it. Eleanor looked at that understanding and did not say a word about it because he had not asked her to, and because she understood that some things needed to be approached the way you approached a skittish horse, without sudden movements, without reaching simply by being there consistently until the animal decided on its own terms to come closer. "The beef stew is better tomorrow than today," she said. "I'd leave it for the morning meal." He blinked, and then the almost smile came. "Noted," he said. He put his hat back on and went out. Eleanor listened to his footsteps cross the yard and thought about the third woman and what she had said about being lonely beside someone who couldn't see her. Eleanor thought Nathaniel Carter could see her. She thought the problem was that he hadn't yet decided whether seeing her was something he was going to let himself do. She thought about that for the rest of the evening. Outside, the Montana summer was doing what it did in late August, cooling towards something that carried the first warning of what was coming. A sharpness in the dark that said winter was not a theory, but a scheduled event, and that everything left undone before it arrived would remain undone until spring. Eleanor added 2 items to her supply order. Then she banked the stove for the night and went to bed. She was still here. That, for now, was the thing that mattered most. The 5th week began with a letter. It arrived on the Friday supply wagon from Silver Creek, tucked between a hardware invoice and a seed catalog, and Hicks handed it to Nathaniel without ceremony, the way he handed over everything quietly, without opinion. Nathaniel looked at the return address, and something in his face closed in the particular way Eleanor had come to recognize as the expression he wore when something required management. He did not mention the letter at supper. He did not mention it that evening either, when they sat in the habitual quiet that had developed between them over the past weeks. That hour after the hands retired, when the house settled, and the 2 of them occupied the same room with the natural ease of people who had stopped performing comfort and were simply comfortable. Eleanor did not ask about it. She had learned the architecture of Nathaniel Carter's silences by then. Which ones were the ordinary kind? The product of a man who had lived alone long enough that quiet was his native state, and which ones had weight in them, a specific gravity that meant something was being turned over and over in his mind, like a stone being examined from every side. This silence had weight. She found out why the next morning. She was at the stove at 5:15 when Nathaniel came downstairs earlier than usual, already in his coat, and said, "I need to tell you something." Eleanor turned from the stove. "All right." He sat down at the kitchen table, which he did not usually do at this hour, and she understood that whatever was coming required the table between them, the particular formality of sitting across from another person when the news was serious. "The letter yesterday was from a man named Gerald Holt," he said. "He's a land broker out of Helena. He's been trying to buy a section of Carter Ridge for the past 2 years, the eastern grazing section up against the ridge. I've refused twice. Yesterday's letter was a 3rd offer, and it wasn't—" He stopped. "It wasn't a friendly letter." Eleanor waited. "Holt has been buying up land in this valley for 3 years, Nathaniel said. Mostly smaller operations. Some of them sold because they wanted to. Some of them sold because Holt made it easier to sell than to stay." His jaw tightened fractionally. "2 ranchers I know, men who ran solid operations, no debt, good cattle, ended up signing over their land inside of a year. I've never gotten a straight story from either of them about how it happened. What does yesterday's letter say specifically?" He looked at her steadily. "It says he's filed a competing claim on the eastern section based on a survey dispute from 1871. He says he has documentation showing the original Carter Ridge boundary survey was in error, and that approximately 800 acres of what I've been running as my land is legally contestable." The kitchen was quiet. Eleanor set down the spoon she'd been holding. "Is it true?" "I don't know," he said. "My deed goes back to 1872. I've never had the survey question before." He paused. "My original surveyor died in 79. Holt knows that." "Do you have the original survey documents?" "In the strongbox in the office. I haven't looked at them since I filed the deed." "You need to look at them today," Eleanor said. "And you need to get them to a lawyer in Helena before Holt files anything formally. How long did the letter say you have?" Nathaniel blinked. It was the almost imperceptible pause of a man recalibrating. 60 days before he pursues the claim formally." "Then you have 59 days to make sure he can't," Eleanor said. "Who's your lawyer in Helena?" "I've used a man named Prescott. He handles the ranch contracts." "Send him a wire today. Get Hicks on the road to town within the hour." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "You're not asking me whether I think it's serious," he said. "I think you already know it's serious," Eleanor said. "I think you came down here this early because you needed to tell someone and think out loud, and I think the thinking out loud is done. The next step is practical." She held his gaze. "Do you disagree?" He was quiet for a single beat. "No," he said. "I don't." "Then let's get Hicks on the road. He stood, and something in the motion had a different quality than his usual movement, less contained, like a man who had been carrying something alone, and had just for the first time in a very long while put a portion of it down. He went to send Hicks. Eleanor went back to the stove and thought about Gerald Holt and land surveys, and the particular kind of man who waited until someone's original surveyor was dead before filing a competing claim. She thought about it carefully, because she had a feeling, the specific low-frequency warning feeling, that she had developed over a lifetime of being underestimated by people who assumed she wasn't paying attention, that this situation was not going to resolve quietly. She was right. The wire came back from Prescott and Helena 3 days later. Eleanor was not present when Nathaniel read it, but she read the shift in his bearing when he came into the kitchen that evening, and she said, "What did he say?" Nathaniel put the wire on the table. She read it. Prescott's assessment was measured and professional and deeply unsettling. Holt's claim was not frivolous. There was a legitimate survey dispute in the county records from 1871, a notation made by a different surveyor 1 year before Nathaniel's deed was filed, indicating a discrepancy in the eastern boundary line. Prescott could not say with certainty whether the notation had legal force, but he could say that it would require a formal counter-survey and likely a hearing before the Territorial Land Commissioner to resolve. Cost significant. Timeline 4 to 6 months minimum. Outcome uncertain. Eleanor set the wire down. "He's done this before," she said. "With the other ranchers you mentioned. This is his method." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He finds or manufactures a technical dispute files before you're ready, makes the legal cost of fighting him high enough that settling feels preferable." "Yes, and he's betting that you'll sell the eastern section rather than spend 6 months and considerable money on a legal fight with an uncertain outcome." Nathaniel was quiet. "He's wrong," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "He's wrong if you have someone who can actually look at those original survey documents and understand what they say," she said. "Do you have the field notes? Not just the deed, the actual field notes from the 1872 survey?" "I don't know." "Let's find out." They spent 2 hours in the ranch office that evening going through the strongbox. Mrs. Harding sat in the corner with her knitting and said nothing, which was one of the things Eleanor had come to genuinely appreciate about the woman, her gift for occupying a room without demanding anything of it. The field notes were there. They were at the bottom of the strongbox in a leather folder that had never been opened in Nathaniel's presence because they had come with the deed, and the deed was what mattered, and field notes were the sort of thing a man filed and forgot. Eleanor opened them. She had grown up watching her father, a careful and methodical man, who had surveyed land in Pennsylvania before his health failed work, through exactly this kind of documentation. She did not have formal training. But she understood the notation system, the abbreviation conventions, the way survey field notes recorded their measurements, and the landmarks they used to anchor them. She read the 1872 field notes for 40 minutes without speaking. Nathaniel sat across from her and watched her read. "What are you looking for?" he asked about 20 minutes in. "The benchmark," she said. "The fixed physical point the surveyor used to anchor the eastern boundary line. If it's a natural landmark, a rock formation, a tree, a creek bend, and that landmark is still there and can be physically identified, you can rerun the 1872 survey accurately from the ground up. That gives you independent physical evidence that your boundary line is where it's always been." Nathaniel was very still. "Do you know what you're reading?" he asked. "My father surveyed land," she said without looking up. "I read a great many of his notes before I was old enough for it to seem unusual." She turned a page. "Here, the eastern boundary anchor point is described as..." She read carefully, "a granite outcropping bearing northeast approximately 40 rods east of the creek confluence." She looked up. "Is there a granite outcropping on the eastern section?" Nathaniel's expression had shifted into something new. "Yes," he said. "There is. I've ridden past it 100 times. It's exactly where the eastern section begins." Then the 1871 notation Holt is using the competing survey, what physical landmark does it describe? I don't have that document. Prescott does. Wire him tomorrow and ask him to describe the anchor point from the 1871 notation. She closed the field notes and looked at Nathaniel directly. If the 1871 notation used a different or a non-specific landmark, a tree that's no longer there, a creek feature that's changed, and your 1872 notes use a fixed granite outcropping that's still physically identifiable, Holt's claim falls apart under a proper survey. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Eleanor, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She was aware of it in the way you're aware of a change in air pressure, something atmospheric had shifted, something that was going to require acknowledgement. Eventually, though this was not the moment. Send the wire tomorrow, she said. Let's see what Prescott says. He sent the wire. Prescott's response came 4 days later, and it said exactly what Eleanor had suspected. The 1871 notation referenced a tree line on the eastern slope as its anchor point, and the description was generic enough that it could be applied to several different locations in the area. There was no single fixed physical landmark. Nathaniel read the wire twice. Then he looked at Eleanor across the kitchen table and said, "You were right. Your 1872 survey was right," she corrected. "I just read it correctly." "You saved this ranch 800 acres, he said. "Not yet," she said. "You still need a counter-survey and Prescott still needs to take it to the land commissioner. But you now have the argument that wins." He was quiet for a moment with an expression she had not seen on him before open in a way that his face almost never was, as if the controlled management of himself had slipped briefly and she was seeing something that usually lived behind it. "I don't understand," he said, "why 7 men passed you over." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Because they were looking at something else," she said. He held her gaze. And then, very carefully, as if he were doing something that required precision, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. Mrs. Harding in the corner turned a page of the Bible she had switched to at some point and said nothing whatsoever, which Eleanor suspected required a considerable exercise of self-discipline on the woman's part. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel's hand over hers. She thought about 7 platforms and the specific weight of accumulated rejection and the way hope had to be rationed to survive it. She thought about the 3rd woman who had left because she felt invisible beside a man who couldn't see her. She thought that Nathaniel Carter could see her. She thought that was in the end the only thing that had ever mattered. She did not move her hand. The crisis, when it came in its second and more dangerous form, arrived on a Tuesday in the 5th week's end. And it arrived in the person of Gerald Holt himself. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon come into the yard. She heard Nathaniel's voice outside, clipped and controlled in the way it got when he was managing something that required management, and another voice she didn't recognize. She went to the window. The man climbing down from the wagon was perhaps 50 broad and well-dressed in the way of men who wanted to project prosperity without quite achieving elegance. He wore a good coat and a poor expression, the expression of a man accustomed to situations resolving in his favor and currently encountering one that wasn't. Gerald Holt had not waited for the legal process to play out. He had come in person. Eleanor dried her hands and went to the door. She heard the exchange from the porch. She did not go into the yard because she understood that inserting herself immediately was not the right move, that Nathaniel needed to handle the first pass of this himself, and that her role, if it became necessary, was to be the second line rather than the first. "Mr. Carter," Holt was saying with a warmth that had nothing warm in it. "I wanted to come out personally, clear up any misunderstanding. I've got a great deal of respect for what you've built here, and I'd hate for a legal matter to damage it." "There's no misunderstanding to clear up," Nathaniel said. "I've consulted my lawyer. The counter-survey is being scheduled." Something shifted in Holt's expression. "Now that seems like an expensive path when you've manufactured a claim designed to make the legal cost feel worse than the settlement." "Yes, I'm aware of the calculation." Nathaniel's voice was even, not raised, just clear. "I've also spoken with Ed Morrison and Frank Callahan about how their sales came together." Silence. Eleanor watched Holt's face from the porch. She saw the moment he recalculated. She saw the moment he understood that this particular approach was not going to work the way it had worked before, and she saw what came after that, the microscopic shift of a man moving to his secondary strategy. He looked past Nathaniel. He looked at Eleanor on the porch, and something crossed his face that she had seen before on other faces in other contexts. The specific recognition that there was a point of pressure available that hadn't been tried yet. "I didn't know you'd remarried Carter," Holt said pleasantly. "I haven't," Nathaniel said. "Ah." Holt looked at Eleanor with an expression that was polite on the surface and nothing like polite underneath it. "Then you must be the—" he paused, "housekeeper." Eleanor came down the porch steps. She did it slowly without hurry, the way she did everything that required her to move through someone else's deliberate unpleasantness. She crossed the yard and she stood beside Nathaniel, and she looked at Gerald Holt with the expression she had developed across 7 platforms and several hundred smaller cruelties, not cold, not angry, simply clear. Like a woman who had heard worse and had decided long ago that the opinion of men like this one was not a currency she traded in. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "I'm Mr. Carter's." She paused for exactly 1 beat, "partner in managing this ranch. And I've spent considerable time this past week reviewing the 1872 survey field notes in detail." Holt's expression flickered. The eastern boundary anchor point is a granite outcropping that has been in the same location since before this territory was mapped. Eleanor continued. "The 1871 notation you're using as the basis of your claim references a tree line with no fixed physical description. A proper survey will establish that discrepancy clearly and on the record." She looked at him without blinking. "I believe you already know this, Mr. Holt, because I believe you're a careful man who researches his claims before he makes them. Which means you know that this particular claim doesn't hold." Holt looked at her for a long moment. "You're very confident for a—" He stopped himself, but not quickly enough. "For a woman," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Yes, I find confidence tends to follow competence. Have you found it otherwise?" The yard was very quiet. Eleanor was aware peripherally that several of the hands had arranged themselves at various points around the yard, near the barn door, at the corral fence, along the bunkhouse wall, with the particular casualness of men who happened to be where they happened to be and were definitely not watching a confrontation unfold. She was aware that Clay Dawson was at the barn door with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had recently updated his opinion of someone. Holt straightened his coat. "This isn't finished," he said to Nathaniel. "The survey will finish it," Nathaniel said. "Legally and on the record." Holt got back into his wagon without another word and drove out of the yard. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Pete said from somewhere near the water trough, "Well, I'll be." And Clay Dawson from the barn door said, "Miss Whitmore." Just that. Just her name. But with a weight in it that communicated a complete sentence. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was looking at her with that open expression she'd seen across the kitchen table, the one that usually lived behind the controlled management of himself. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You would have handled it," she said. "I simply wanted him to understand that there was more than one person on this ranch who knew what he was doing." He was quiet. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes?" "The 6 weeks are up in 4 days." She held very still. "I know," she said. "I'd like—" He stopped. Restarted with the careful precision of a man who knew that some things required more accuracy than a fence line. "I'd like you to stay. Not on a trial basis. As my wife. If you're willing." The yard was absolutely silent. Eleanor was aware of 20-some men finding urgent business in every direction that was not directly at them. She looked at Nathaniel Carter, this weathered, contained, careful man, who had looked at her on a platform 6 weeks ago, like she was something he was genuinely trying to understand, and who had spent 6 weeks doing exactly that, without performance, without charity, without the specific condescension of a man doing a woman a favor. She thought about what he was offering. It was not a romance out of a magazine. It was not flowers and poetry and soft words spoken in comfortable parlors. It was a hard ranch on a Montana mountain, and 25 men and brutal winters, and the work of building something real beside a person who was damaged in specific and survivable ways. And who was she now understood, trying in the particular way of people who have been hurt badly and are not certain whether trying is still a thing they're capable of. It was, she thought, more than she'd expected, and different from what she'd imagined, and exactly what she'd said she was looking for on a platform in Silver Creek 6 weeks ago. A partner. Not a keeper. A partner. Yes, she said. Something moved through Nathaniel's face, complicated and unguarded and entirely real. Yes, he said, as if confirming it to himself. With one condition, Eleanor added. He blinked. Name it. You wire Prescott today and make sure the counter-survey is scheduled before the end of the month. I am not spending my first winter on this ranch with an unresolved land claim hanging over 800 acres of our eastern grazing section. The almost smile arrived. And then, for the first time in the 6 weeks Eleanor had been watching for it, it went all the way. It became an actual smile, brief, genuine, entirely without performance. Done, he said. From the direction of the barn, Clay Dawson made a sound that was entirely unprofessional for a man of his experience and tenure, and Pete said something that made 2 other men laugh, and Mrs. Harding appeared on the porch with an expression that suggested she had been watching from the house and had known how this was going to resolve for at least 2 weeks. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. He was still smiling. She thought she could spend a long time looking at Nathaniel Carter when he forgot to manage himself. She thought she would probably have the opportunity. But the land claim was not finished, not even close to finished, and in the days that followed, Eleanor discovered that Gerald Holt was not a man who recalculated gracefully. The counter-survey was scheduled. Prescott sent confirmation. The physical evidence was solid, and every professional assessment indicated that Carter Ridge's 1872 boundary would hold under scrutiny. Holt knew this, which was why he didn't wait for the survey. What he did instead came to Eleanor's attention on a Thursday morning 3 days after his visit to the ranch in the form of a conversation she was not supposed to hear. She was in the cold larder off the kitchen, taking stock of the winter supplies that had come up on Friday's wagon when she heard boots on the kitchen floor, and 2 voices. One was Clay Dawson. The other she didn't recognize immediately, a younger voice, quick and careful in the way of a man who was accustomed to delivering news that people didn't want. Holt's been in town, the younger voice said. 2 days. He's been talking to people. Talking how? Clay said. Talking the kind of talk that gets into a community and sits there. A pause. He's been saying things about the woman. Eleanor's hands went still on the shelf in front of her. What kind of things? Clay said, and his voice had a particular quality to it, quiet in the way that was more dangerous than loud. That she's a schemer. That she came out here with a plan to get her hands on Carter Ridge. That she found out about the land claim from someone in Silver Creek and positioned herself on that platform on purpose. Another pause. He's been telling people she was seen going through Nathaniel's papers. Silence. Eleanor set down the jar she was holding very carefully. And people are listening, Clay asked. Some of them. Enough. The younger voice dropped. There's a meeting Friday night at Morrison's place. Some of the Valley families. Holt's going to be there. Eleanor came out of the cold larder. Both men turned. Clay Dawson looked at her with the expression of a man who understood that she had heard every word and was making a rapid assessment of how much damage had been done. How long has he been working this? She asked. Since he came out here, most likely, Clay said. He knew he wasn't going to win the legal fight, so he's running a different play. He's trying to isolate the ranch socially, Eleanor said. If the Valley families turn against Carter Ridge, if Nathaniel becomes the man who brought an opportunistic outsider in and let her rifle through his business, the legal fight gets harder. Witnesses become unreliable. Goodwill dries up. She looked at Clay steadily. He's not coming after the land directly. He's coming after Nathaniel's standing. Clay was quiet. Through you, he said. Yes. Another silence. What do you want to do? Clay asked. Eleanor thought for exactly 3 seconds. I want to be at that meeting Friday night, she said. Clay looked at her. That's not... I'm aware it's not comfortable, she said. I'm going to need Nathaniel to take me. Clay exhaled slowly. He's not going to like it. No, Eleanor agreed. He's going to like what happens if we don't go considerably less. She looked at Clay. Will you come? He looked back at her for a long moment. This woman he had spent the first week testing, and the second week reconsidering, and every week since then revising upward. Yes, ma'am, he said. This time when he said it, it sounded like something he meant in every possible direction. Nathaniel, when she told him, did not like it. He stood in the ranch office with the wire from Prescott in one hand and the news of Holt's campaign in the community in the place where the rest of his attention was, and he said no. Nathaniel, I'm not taking you into a room where Holt has spent a week poisoning the well against you. You don't deserve to sit there and... What I don't deserve, Eleanor said clearly, is to have my reputation disassembled in a room I'm not in, while the people hearing it have no counterpoint. She looked at him. If we don't go, the story Holt is telling becomes the only story, and it will follow this ranch and follow me and follow you for years. I can talk to Morrison myself, and what will you say? That the woman who's been living on your ranch for 6 weeks is trustworthy. On what evidence your word? She held his gaze. They need to see me, they need to hear me, and they need to see that I'm not afraid of what Holt is saying, because people who are actually guilty of something do not walk into the room where they're being accused. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. He's going to say things, he said. In that room in front of those people, he's going to say things that, I have survived 7 public rejections on platforms in front of crowds of strangers, Eleanor said quietly. I think I can manage 1 room. He was silent. He looked at her with that open expression, and something that she understood now that she knew him well enough to read it was not just reluctance. It was fear. Not of Holt, not of the meeting, of watching someone he had let himself care about be hurt in front of him. I'll be right there, she said more quietly. The whole time. He breathed out slowly. We leave at 6, he said. The meeting at Morrison's place on Friday night was everything Eleanor had expected, and several things she had not. The room held perhaps 30 people, valley ranchers and their wives, a few business owners from Silver Creek people, who represented the social and economic fabric of the community that Carter Ridge existed within. Gerald Holt was there standing near the fireplace with the relaxed posture of a man on his home territory. He saw Eleanor walk in with Nathaniel and Clay, and something crossed his face, quickly gone within a second, but Eleanor caught it. He had not expected her to come. That alone was worth the drive. Morrison, a large, gray-bearded man who ran the valley's largest cattle operation after Carter Ridge, and who had apparently lost approximately 200 acres to Holt's methods 2 years ago, called the meeting to order with the blunt efficiency of a man who had been too polite for too long. We're here because Gerald Holt's been making claims about Carter Ridge and the woman out there, Morrison said, without preamble. Seems to me the cleanest thing is to have the interested parties in the same room. Mr. Holt, you want to say what you've been saying? Holt smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and warm. I just have some concerns, he said, about the situation out at Carter Ridge. A woman who appears on a marriage platform at the exact moment Carter discovers he has a land claim issue, who moves into his home and begins going through his private business documents almost immediately. He shook his head with what was meant to look like reluctant honesty. I think Nathaniel Carter is a good man who's been taken advantage of, and I think this valley deserves to know that. The room was very quiet. Eleanor stood up. She didn't ask permission. She didn't look at Nathaniel or at Clay. She simply stood up the way she had stood on 7 platforms, and she looked at Gerald Holt with the clear, calm expression of a woman who has made her peace with being underestimated. Mr. Holt, she said, I wonder if you'd like to explain to this room exactly how the 1871 survey notation that forms the basis of your land claim describes its eastern boundary anchor point. Silence. Because I've read it, she continued. And I've read the 1872 Carter Ridge field notes, and I'd be very interested in your explanation for why your claim uses a non-specific tree line description, while the Carter Ridge survey uses a fixed granite outcropping that is physically present on the land today. Holt's smile did not move, but something behind it did. That's a matter for the land commissioner. Yes, who is going to receive a full documented comparison of both surveys with photographs of the physical landmarks submitted by a lawyer in Helena who has been handling Carter Ridge's legal matters for 11 years. Eleanor looked at him steadily. Which you already knew before you came to this ranch and tried to suggest I was a schemer because a careful man researches his position before he commits to it. And you are a careful man, Mr. Holt. The two ranchers in this valley who lost land to you in the past 3 years would confirm that. She looked at the room, at Morrison, whose expression was doing something complicated and attentive, at the men and women who had come to hear a story about a woman who didn't belong and were getting something different. I came to Carter Ridge on a trial arrangement, she said. 6 weeks. I organized a supply system that was critically understocked before winter. I identified a fire risk that, if it had continued unaddressed, would have cost this ranch its kitchen building. I learned the operations well enough to recognize a legal threat for what it was, not an accident, not a legitimate claim, but a manufactured dispute designed to make the cost of fighting feel worse than the cost of settling. She paused. And when Mr. Carter asked me to stay permanently, I said yes. Because this is a good ranch run by a good man, and because I have no interest in anyone's land or money, I have interest in what I said I was looking for when I came west. A partner, work that matters, a life built on something real. She sat down. The room was silent for a long beat. Then Morrison said, Holt, I think you ought to take your concerns somewhere else. Gerald Holt looked at the room. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Nathaniel Carter, who had not moved or spoken, and who was looking at Eleanor with an expression that the room could read as clearly as she could. Holt picked up his hat. He left without another word. The room exhaled. And then Morrison's wife, a solid woman named Ruth, who had not spoken during the entire meeting, stood up and said to Eleanor directly and without preamble, Honey, can you make a proper beef stew? Because I have been feeding this valley for 20 years, and I would not say no to a second opinion. The laughter that broke through the room was the kind that releases something. Eleanor felt it release in her, too. Not the fear she'd refused to perform, but the held breath of a woman who had walked into a room where she was the subject of a story and had walked back out as the author of it. In the wagon on the way home, Clay Dawson drove, and Mrs. Harding sat beside him, and Nathaniel and Eleanor sat in the wagon bed with the dark Montana sky overhead and the cold coming down through it, the way it did in late September, serious and without apology. Nathaniel said quietly, You knew he wasn't expecting you to come. Yes. That was the whole plan, wasn't it? Walk in before he could prepare for it. Partly, Eleanor said. The rest of it was just the truth. The truth tends to manage itself if you say it clearly and directly in the right room. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You are the most unexpected person I have ever met. Eleanor considered this. Is that a compliment? It is the truest thing I know how to say to you right now, he said. She looked at him in the dark. He was not managing himself. He was just Nathaniel, the man behind the controlled quietness, who had built a ranch out of grief and needed someone to build it with, who had looked at her on a platform and seen something real, who was sitting in a wagon on a cold Montana night looking at her like she was the most solid thing in his world. Eleanor took his hand. He held it. The wagon rolled north toward Carter Ridge, through the dark and the cold and the pines, and neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. They were married on the first Saturday of October, not in Silver Creek, not in a church with pews full of people who had watched Eleanor stand on that platform and decided she was someone to pity. Nathaniel had offered, and Eleanor had declined, and when he asked her where she wanted it done, she had said without hesitation, Here, on the ranch, with the people who actually know us. So it was Mrs. Harding's Bible and Morrison's presence as a witness, and every hand on Carter Ridge, standing in the yard, in their cleanest shirts. And Pete had made a cake that was not entirely successful, but was made with genuine effort. And Clay Dawson stood at Nathaniel's right side, with the expression of a man who had revised his opinions several times in the past 6 weeks and was currently at peace with where they had landed. The ceremony was short. Nathaniel held her hands and looked at her with that unmanaged expression she had come to understand was his version of everything he couldn't put into words, and Eleanor looked back at him with the steadiness she brought to everything that mattered. And when Mrs. Harding asked the questions, they both answered them clearly and without hesitation. When it was done, Pete started a fire in the yard, and someone produced a fiddle from somewhere. And the evening went long and warm in the way of occasions that earned their warmth rather than performing it. At some point, Clay Dawson appeared at Eleanor's elbow with 2 cups of something hot and said quietly, "I owe you an apology for the first week." "You owe me nothing," Eleanor said. "You were protecting something you cared about. That's not an apology situation." He looked at her for a moment. "You're a very unusual woman, Mrs. Carter." It was the first time anyone had called her that. She felt it land the name, the weight of it, the particular realness of being called something you had not quite let yourself expect. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson," she said. He nodded once, and that was the whole of it, which was exactly right. Nathaniel found her an hour later standing at the edge of the yard where the firelight thinned into dark, and he stood beside her, and they looked at the same thing for a while without either of them saying what it was. "All right?" he asked. "Better than all right," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders carefully, the way he did everything that was new to him, with the precision of a man who understood that carefulness was its own form of respect. And she leaned into him slightly, and they stood there while the fiddle played and the men talked. And Montana came down around them cold and enormous, and entirely indifferent. Eleanor thought, "I am home." She had not thought that about any place in 6 years. She let herself think it now. The counter-survey happened 3 weeks after the wedding on a Tuesday that came in cold and clear and stayed that way. Prescott came up from Helena himself. Eleanor had suggested this in a wire reasoning, that his physical presence at the survey communicated a level of legal seriousness that a report sent by mail could not, and the surveyor he'd hired was a meticulous man named Aldridge, who spent 4 hours on the eastern section, with his equipment and his field notes and his careful silence. Eleanor was there for the entire survey. Nathaniel had not asked her to come. She had simply appeared at the barn door in her coat and her boots at 6:30 in the morning when the horses were being saddled, and he had looked at her and said, "You'll want your heavy gloves," and she had gone back to get them. She stood on the eastern section in the October cold, and she watched Aldridge work. And she answered his questions about the 1872 field notes from memory, because she had read them enough times that they lived in her the way anything lives in you when you've been paying the kind of attention that matters. When Aldridge found the granite outcropping exactly where the 1872 notes said it would be exactly where Eleanor had told Nathaniel it would be weeks ago, he stopped and looked at it for a long moment and then looked at Eleanor. "You read the original field notes," he said. "I did. Carefully. I don't know another way to read something important." He made a note. "This resolves the claim," he said. "The 1871 notation cannot be anchored to any fixed physical point that corresponds to this boundary line. Your 1872 survey is the controlling document." Nathaniel was very still beside her. "Put that in writing," Prescott said with the satisfaction of a lawyer who had been right about something and wanted it documented. On the ride back to the ranch, Nathaniel was quiet in the weighted way. The way that meant something was being turned over, not in distress, but with the careful attention of a man who needed to sit with a thing before he could speak it. Eleanor rode beside him and waited. Halfway back he said, "You knew the first night, when you read those notes." "I was fairly certain," she said. "I didn't want to tell you I was certain until the physical survey confirmed it. False certainty isn't useful." "No," he said. "It isn't." Another silence. "Eleanor?" "Yes. I would have lost that section," he said, "without you reading those notes. I would have fought it, and Prescott is good, but he wouldn't have thought to look for the anchor point the way you did. I might have won, Or I might have lost, and I would never have known that there was a physical argument sitting in that strongbox that settled it completely. She looked at him. You didn't lose it, she said. Because of you. Because it was yours, she said. I just read the paperwork. He shook his head slowly, which was as close as he came to arguing with her, and they rode the rest of the way in a silence that had nothing uncomfortable in it. The winter came in November, and it came the way Montana winters come. Not gradually, not with the polite warning that winters in softer climates offered, but abruptly and with complete commitment, as if the season had been waiting behind a door and someone had finally opened it all the way. Eleanor had prepared for it. She had been preparing for it since the first week when she'd identified the supply shortfall and sent Hicks to town, and everything she'd done in the intervening months had been building toward this. The sealed barrels, the properly stocked cellar, the reorganized storage that meant any item could be found in under 2 minutes. The carefully managed quantities that she had calculated against the length of a Montana winter, and the appetite of 25 hard-working men. The first real test came in mid-November, when a 3-day storm closed the road from town, and the ranch became for 72 hours entirely self-contained. She had seen it coming 2 days before. The specific quality of the air, the way the horses behaved, certain signs that the men who'd lived in Montana long enough could read, and that she had been learning to read since she arrived. She had spent those 2 days running the final checks on every supply, every heating fuel store, every emergency contingency she'd built into the household management. When the storm hit, Carter Ridge was ready. The men were fed, the animals were sheltered, the house was warm, nobody was in danger. On the second day of the storm, Pete found her in the kitchen in the early afternoon and said with an expression she had never quite seen on his weathered face before, "Miss Eleanor, Mrs. Carter, I want you to know, this is the best run winter I've seen on this ranch in 9 years. Eleanor looked at him. 9 years is a long time to compare against, she said. Yes, ma'am. That's the point I'm making. She went back to her work, but she held Pete's words in the private place she kept things that mattered, the place where she'd been storing the small accumulated evidence of her own belonging, building it up piece by piece the way you build anything that needs to last. It was on the third day of the storm that the thing happened which neither of them had prepared for. Nathaniel had gone out to check on the horses at midday, a routine he maintained regardless of weather, because there were things about the horses that required his specific attention and that he did not delegate. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard the commotion in the yard, and she heard Pete's voice first sharp in a way she had never heard it, and she was at the door before she consciously decided to move. Nathaniel was being helped across the yard by 2 of the hands. He was walking, which was the first thing she assessed. He was upright and moving under his own power, which meant the immediate catastrophic possibilities were off the table. But his right arm was held at a particular angle, and his face, even from across the yard, had the specific set of someone managing serious pain. "What happened?" Eleanor said, coming down the steps. "Ice," Pete said. "Coming out of the barn. He went down hard." "Get him inside." She had the kitchen table cleared before they were through the door. She had him seated and his coat off before the hands had finished filing in to watch, and she said, "Out. All of you. Pete, stay." And the hands went because there was something in her voice that they had learned over the past months was not a voice that brooked the wrong kind of delay. She looked at the arm. She was not a doctor. She was clear-eyed about what she was and wasn't, and she said so immediately. "I can tell you whether it's broken or whether it's the joint. I cannot tell you more than that. Where exactly is the pain?" "Shoulder," Nathaniel said. He said it evenly, which was impressive, given what she could see when she carefully moved his coat away. "The shoulder came out," Pete said from behind her. Eleanor looked. Pete was right. The shape was wrong in the specific way of a joint that had been displaced. "Has this happened before?" she said to Nathaniel. "Once. Years ago. The doctor in Helena." "I know what needs doing," Eleanor said. "The question is whether you can manage the process of it because it requires a specific motion. and it is going to hurt considerably before it stops hurting." He looked at her steadily. "Do it," he said. "Pete." Eleanor said, "I need you to brace his left side. Hold him still. I mean completely still. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." She had watched her father have his shoulders set twice. She had read enough basic medical references to know the procedure with the careful thoroughness she brought to every practical skill she'd ever needed. She knew what she was doing. She also knew it was going to be one of the harder things she'd done in front of another person, because the other person was Nathaniel. And doing something painful to him was categorically different from doing something difficult. "Ready," she said. "Yes," he said. She set his shoulder. He made one sound short, controlled the kind of sound a man makes when he has decided in advance how much sound he's going to allow himself. And then it was done, and the arm was back where it belonged, and Eleanor held it steady for a moment while she checked the alignment and watched his face to make sure the color was returning properly. It was. She exhaled. "Done," she said. He exhaled too long and slow, like a man releasing something he'd been holding with his entire body. "Thank you," he said. "You're going to need to rest that arm for at least 2 weeks. No riding, no lifting. I mean it." "Eleanor, Nathaniel." She looked at him directly. "The ranch will not fall apart in 2 weeks. I will be here. The men know their jobs. You will rest the arm." He looked at her with that particular expression somewhere between argument and something that was not argument at all. "Yes," he said. "Good." Pete made a sound behind her that he converted inadequately into a cough. The 2 weeks of Nathaniel's recovery were unexpectedly the weeks that changed the most between them. Not because difficulty had been required to deepen something it hadn't been. What had grown between them over the trial period and the land claim and the wedding had been real and grounded, and not dependent on crisis to sustain itself. But because 2 weeks of Nathaniel not being able to run at full capacity meant 2 weeks of Nathaniel in the house more than usual present at hours when he was normally out on the range, available for the kind of extended time together that the ordinary rhythm of ranch life didn't naturally produce. It meant mornings at the kitchen table with coffee that went cold, while they talked about things that neither of them had gotten around to before her years in Philadelphia, before she'd started the programs, his early years building the ranch, the shape of what they each thought a life should look like, and the various ways circumstances had revised those shapes. It meant evenings that ran later, the two of them on either side of the fireplace in the front room, while the winter ran itself hard against the windows, talking or reading, or simply existing in the same space, with the ease of people who had stopped needing to perform anything for each other. It was during one of those evenings about 10 days into his recovery that Nathaniel said something that Eleanor had not expected. He had been quiet for a while, the weighted kind which she read correctly, and then he said, "I owe you an honest thing." She looked up from her book. When Alcott brought the program to Silver Creek, he said, "I didn't intend to participate. I rode into town that day for the land office. The program was, I knew it was happening, and I had decided it wasn't relevant to me." He paused. "I told myself I didn't need a wife. I told myself the ranch ran fine, and I was managing, and the arrangement I had was sufficient." Eleanor waited. "I was lying to myself," he said. "I was very good at it. 6 years is a long time to practice something." He looked at her steadily. "When I saw you on that platform, I didn't understand immediately why I stopped. I told myself it was the practical assessment I described to you at breakfast. And that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." "What was the rest of it?" she asked. "You were standing there like you'd decided something," he said. "Not like you were waiting to be chosen, like you'd decided on your own terms what the next thing was going to be, regardless of what happened next. And He stopped. "I hadn't made a decision like that in 6 years. I'd been running on the decisions I made right after my wife died, the ones that said, build the ranch, keep it running. Don't need anything that could be taken away." He looked at his hands. "When I saw you standing like that, I thought that woman has decided to keep living, and I wasn't sure I had." The fire moved in the grate between them. Eleanor set her book down. "Nathaniel," she said quietly, "I'm not..." I'm not in a dark place, he said quickly. I don't mean it that way. I mean that I'd contracted myself down so far that I'd stopped noticing the contraction. I thought I was fine. I thought the ranch was what I needed, and the work was enough, and I was... He paused. I was the third woman's description of loneliness from the inside. Lonely beside myself. And I didn't know it until you showed up, and the house started having a different quality to it. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. You told me you weren't offering romance, she said. I wasn't. I didn't know I had it to offer. He met her eyes. I'm not sure I have the words for what I'm trying to say. You don't need the words, she said. I understand what you're saying. Do you? You're saying you came back to yourself, she said. And you're telling me because you think I should know. He was quiet. Yes, he said. Eleanor stood up and crossed the room and sat beside him on the settee, close enough that their arms touched, and she said, I need to tell you an honest thing, too. He looked at her. I came to Silver Creek expecting to fail, she said. Not hoping to fail, I don't work that way, but expecting it. I had been failed 7 times by the same mechanism, and I had gotten very good at managing the emotional cost of that, and the way I managed it was to pre-accept the loss before it happened. I walked onto that platform already holding the rejection in advance, so it couldn't surprise me. She paused. When you stopped your horse, I didn't let myself feel anything. I managed it the same way I managed everything. I thought this is probably another version of something I've survived before. Manage accordingly. When did that change? He asked. The first morning, she said, when you sat down at that table and you said not a keeper, a partner. She looked at him. Nobody had ever said that to me. In all 7 programs, not once had anyone described what they were looking for in a way that corresponded to what I actually was. They were looking for softness or prettiness or a particular kind of compliance. You were looking for, she paused, me. A specific thing that I actually am. And I thought this man is either extraordinary or he doesn't understand what he's saying. And I decided to find out which. Nathaniel's expression had that open quality again, the unmanaged version of himself. And, he said. Extraordinary, Eleanor said, categorically. He covered her hand with his the way he had at the kitchen table weeks ago, and this time neither of them was at a table in the middle of a practical problem, and Mrs. Harding was not in the corner, and the gesture meant something different with all of that removed from around it. It meant, I see you. It meant I chose this. It meant everything that neither of them had the specific habit of saying in the full sentimental version, and both of them understood perfectly without it. The recovery period ended, the arm healed cleanly, and January brought the hard cold that Montana reserved for those who had decided to stay, and Carter Ridge held. It held because the supplies were right, and the systems were right, and 25 men knew their jobs, and the woman who ran the household ran it with the efficient warmth of someone who understood that warmth and efficiency were not opposing forces, that you could care deeply about the people in your charge, and still require things of them, and still maintain the standards that kept everyone safe and fed and functioning. The men felt it, not sentimentally, not in any way any of them would have named openly, but in the way that people feel when a place has found its right shape, a certain quality of ease, a reduction in the low-level friction that accompanies lives, organized by improvisation rather than intention. Will Ferris, the young hand whose terrible day Eleanor had managed back in September, had turned into one of the most reliable men on the ranch. He worked with a different quality now, attentive in a way that came from understanding why care mattered, not just from fear of consequence. He had looked at Eleanor one morning at breakfast with an expression that was not quite son looking at mother, and not quite employee looking at employer, and entirely its own thing, and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Carter, for September." "Don't thank me," she'd said. "Thank yourself. I just pointed at the road. You walked it." He'd nodded and gone back to his eggs, and Clay Dawson, 2 seats down, had not said anything, but had looked at his own breakfast with the expression of a man who was thinking carefully about something. It was Clay who brought the next trouble to Eleanor's door, and he brought it in February on a morning when Nathaniel was out on the northern section and wouldn't be back until evening. He appeared at the kitchen door in the mid-morning with his hat in his hands and an expression Eleanor had never seen on him. Something uncertain, which on Clay's face was as alarming as panic would have been on anyone else's. "Clay," she said, "sit down." "I'll stand." He turned the hat in his hands. "I need to tell you something that you're not going to like, and that Nathaniel needs to know, but I'm telling you first, because I think you'll know the right way to handle it." Eleanor set down her work entirely. "Tell me." "Holt's back," he said. "Not at the ranch, in town. He's been there 3 weeks. I just found out from a man in Silver Creek who thought I already knew." "What's he doing in town?" "He's bought the Morrison property." Eleanor went very still. "Morrison sold," she said. "Signed the papers 2 weeks ago. I don't know the circumstances. The man I talked to says Morrison didn't look like a man who wanted to sell. He looked like a man who'd been—" Clay paused, choosing his word, maneuvered. Eleanor thought about this carefully. "If Holt owns Morrison's land," she said, "he has property on the southern boundary of Carter Ridge." "Yes. Which means the access road to our southern pasture runs through land that Holt now controls." Clay's expression confirmed what she already knew. "He doesn't need to fight the eastern section anymore," Eleanor said. "He has a different lever now. If he closes that road or disputes the access easement, we lose the southern pasture for grazing," Clay said, "which is 15% of our total range. In spring and summer it's more significant than that. It's where we move the breeding stock." Eleanor looked at the table for a moment. "Does Nathaniel know about Morrison?" she asked. "No, I came straight here." "All right," she thought. "I need to see the deed to Carter Ridge, specifically the access easement language for the southern road. It should be in the same strongbox as the survey documents." "What are you looking for?" "Whether the easement is a permanent recorded easement or a neighborly arrangement. If it's recorded, Holt can't close it regardless of who owns the land. If it's a neighborly arrangement—" She didn't finish the sentence. "If it's neighborly," Clay said quietly, "Holt can close it day after tomorrow." "Get me the deed," Eleanor said. She had the strongbox open and the deed in her hands within 10 minutes of Clay leaving the kitchen, and she read the access language with the focused attention she'd brought to the survey field notes 4 months ago. Careful, thorough looking for the specific language that answered the specific question. She found it on the 3rd page. She read it twice. Then she sat back and thought about what it meant. The easement was recorded. It was in the county records filed with the original deed in 1872, and it described the access road to the southern pasture as a permanent right-of-way benefiting the Carter Ridge property, running across what was then described as the Morrison homestead parcel. It was permanent. It was recorded. It was legal. Holt couldn't touch it. But that was not the thing that held Eleanor's attention as she read the document a 3rd time. The thing that held her attention was the language on the 4th page, the section describing the eastern boundary, which she had read months ago, and which now, in the context of what Clay had told her about Morrison's sale, had a different resonance. There was a notation she had registered, but not weighted appropriately the first time, a reference to a shared survey marker between the Carter Ridge eastern section and the Morrison southern boundary, a single fixed point from which both properties' lines were calculated. She looked at that notation for a long time. If Holt had bought Morrison's land specifically because of that shared marker, if he understood that controlling the Morrison property gave him a physical point from which he could contest not just the access road, but the survey interpretation of the eastern boundary, then he hadn't given up on the eastern section at all. He'd gone around it. Eleanor closed the deed. She was still sitting at the kitchen table with it closed in front of her when Nathaniel came in at 6 o'clock and saw her face. He stopped. "What happened?" he said. She told him. All of it: Holt buying the Morrison property, the access easement that was secure, and the shared survey marker that was not. Nathaniel listened without speaking. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Then he said, "He planned this from the beginning." "The eastern section approach was always going to be his backup position," Eleanor said. His primary play was always getting to a point where he controlled a physical boundary marker. He tried the direct legal approach first. When that failed, he bought the adjacent property. He's been working toward this for 2 years. If he can contest the shared marker, he can reopen the eastern boundary question with new physical evidence. Yes. Eleanor looked at him. But here's what he doesn't know, Nathaniel. He doesn't know that I identified the shared marker when I read the deed. He doesn't know that I've been thinking about it since the counter-survey. And he doesn't know, she paused, that I've already written to Prescott about it. Nathaniel went very still. When? 3 weeks ago, when I reread the deed for the supply easement calculation. She held his gaze. I didn't tell you because I wasn't certain it was relevant yet, and I didn't want to create concern about a problem that might not materialize. I was wrong not to tell you. I should have, and I'm telling you now. She paused. Prescott's response is in my room. He says the shared marker creates a theoretical vulnerability, but that it can be neutralized by filing a supplemental survey document that calculates the Carter Ridge eastern boundary from 2 independent fixed points rather than 1. The granite outcropping plus a second fixed marker on the northern boundary. 2 points that cannot be disputed. 2 points that make the shared marker with Morrison's land legally irrelevant to the Carter Ridge calculation. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. You were 3 weeks ahead of him, he said. I wanted to be sure before I said anything, she said. I'm sure now. He was quiet. Outside, the February dark was total, and the cold pressed hard against the house the way Montana cold pressed, not asking permission, simply present. Inside, the kitchen was warm. Nathaniel stood across the table from Eleanor and looked at her with the expression she knew best. Not the controlled, managed version of himself, but the real one. The one that had been present since October and had been growing in visibility as the months made it more familiar to him to let it show. You know what I think, he said. Tell me. I think Gerald Holt is going to spend the rest of his natural life underestimating you, he said. And I think every time he does it, he's going to lose. Eleanor looked at him. Something moved in her, not pride exactly, though there was that. Something quieter. Something that had been a very long time accumulating, and had reached in this kitchen on this February night, the particular weight of a thing fully arrived. She had been passed over 7 times by men who looked at her and saw one thing. She had come to a ranch in the Montana mountains, and she had run it through fire and supply crisis and legal threat and winter and the accumulated pressure of other people's certainty that she didn't belong. And she was still here. Send the wire to Prescott tomorrow, she said. Tell him to file the supplemental survey. First thing, Nathaniel said. She stood and picked up the deed to return it to the strongbox. He crossed the kitchen and took it from her hand, and then because he was Nathaniel and she had learned to read everything about him, she knew what was coming before it came, and she did not step back. He held her face in both hands, this careful, contained man who had spent 6 years contracting himself down to what was essential and was in the particular language of someone who had decided to start opening back up, learning the vocabulary of it one word at a time. Eleanor, he said. Nathaniel, she said. He kissed her. Not the performed version of it. Not with anything self-conscious in it. With the directness he brought to everything that mattered, certain and unhurried and entirely real. Eleanor had waited 34 years for something that felt like this. It was worth it. Outside the window, February ran itself cold and dark across the Montana mountains, and inside Carter Ridge Ranch. The fire burned steady in the grate, and the kitchen held its warmth, and 2 people who had found each other against every reasonable probability stood in the middle of all of it, and were simply completely quietly there. Whatever came next, whatever Holt tried, whatever the spring brought, whatever the long work of building a shared life required, they would meet it from here, from this. From the specific, unhurried, unperformed truth of 2 people who had looked at each other clearly and decided with full information that this was exactly where they meant to be. Prescott filed the supplemental survey in the first week of March. It took 11 days for the Territorial Land Commissioner's office to process it, and during those 11 days, Eleanor went about her work with the particular focused calm of someone who has done everything that can be done and is now waiting for the world to confirm it. She ran the kitchen. She managed the winter stores, which had held exactly as calculated, not surplus, not short, precisely sufficient, which was its own form of satisfaction. She handled the correspondence that had quietly become part of her daily work. Because Nathaniel had discovered early in the winter that Eleanor's written communication was sharper than his own, and had begun routing ranch business letters through her as a matter of course, not by assignment, but by the natural gravity of competence. The men had noticed. They noticed everything she understood, that by now, that 25 men living in close proximity to a household developed the observational habits of people with nothing else to do on long winter evenings, and that the internal social weather of Carter Ridge was as carefully tracked and discussed as the external kind. What they had noticed over the course of the winter was that the ranch ran better, not loudly better, not in ways that announced themselves, but in the specific cumulative way of a system that has found its proper alignment. Fewer crises, shorter recovery times when crises did occur. A household that absorbed the ordinary chaos of ranch life without amplifying it. Pete said it to Clay one morning, and Clay said it to Will Ferris, and by the time it filtered back to Eleanor through the particular informal telegraph of ranch communication, it had acquired a specificity that she thought captured it accurately. "The place has got a brain now," someone had apparently said. "It always had the muscle. Now it's got a brain." She was in the kitchen when she heard that particular formulation, and she thought about it for a while, and she decided it was one of the finest compliments she had ever received, precisely because it had nothing sentimental in it. The land commissioner's ruling arrived on a Wednesday. Prescott sent a wire, and then a letter, and the wire arrived first, which was the nature of wires, and Nathaniel read it in the ranch office, and came to find Eleanor in the kitchen, with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something lighter than his ordinary bearing, as if a weight had been redistributed rather than removed, as if he had been carrying something at a particular angle for so long that setting it down evenly felt new. "Holt's claim is dismissed," he said. "Both the original Eastern Section claim and any derivative claim from the Morrison boundary. The supplemental survey is entered as the controlling document. Carter Ridge Eastern boundary is confirmed." He paused. "Permanently. On the record." Eleanor set down her spoon. "Good," she said. He looked at her. "That's all? What else would you like me to say?" "Most people," he said, "when they've spent 6 months fighting a land claim, and one say something more than good. Most people haven't been planning for this outcome since October," she said. "I've had time to process the victory in advance. The actual confirmation is yes. Good. Exactly what it should be." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, without the contained quality that governed most of his expressions. It was brief and genuine, and entirely without performance, and it changed his face in a way that Eleanor stored carefully, in the place where she kept things that mattered. "Good," he said, echoing her. "Yes, exactly." He crossed the kitchen and held her, and she let herself be held, and outside. The March wind ran cold and purposeful across Carter Ridge, and neither of them paid it any attention. Gerald Holt left Silver Creek 2 weeks after the ruling. He didn't announce his departure. He simply wasn't there one day, and then the days accumulated and he continued not being there, and eventually it became clear that he had moved his operations elsewhere to some other valley with some other ranchers who didn't have an Eleanor Carter reading their survey documents 3 weeks ahead of his next move. Morrison came to Carter Ridge in late March, hat in hand, and expression complicated, to explain what had happened with his sale. Eleanor was in the house, and Nathaniel handled the conversation in the yard, but she heard enough through the window to understand the shape of it. Holt had manufactured a debt claim against Morrison's operation, a piece of old paper that Morrison's lawyer said would take a year to fight and cost more than the land was worth. Morrison had sold to stop the bleeding. When Morrison left, Nathaniel came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway. "He lost his land because he didn't have anyone reading his documents," he said. Eleanor looked up. "Yes. We need to talk to the other Valley families, the ones Holt pressured over the past 3 years. I know. I want to—" He stopped. "I want to do something useful with what happened to us, not just win and move on." Eleanor looked at him steadily. This was the part of Nathaniel Carter that had been emerging since October, incrementally visible as the winter stripped the protective contractions away. The man underneath the managed isolation, the one who had built a ranch, partly out of grief, and partly out of a genuine desire to build something that lasted, something that meant something. "Then let's start with Morrison," she said. "If Holt's claim against him was manufactured the way our Eastern Section claim was manufactured, there may be grounds to contest it even after the sale." Prescott would know. "I'll wire him tomorrow. And the other families there are at least 4 that I've heard named. If they're willing to talk, I can review whatever documentation they have. I'm not a lawyer, but I know what to look for now." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to spend the spring reading strangers' survey documents," he said. "Is that a problem?" "No." The almost smile. "No, Eleanor. It is not a problem." It was at the spring gathering at Morrison's place in April, reinstated now as a community event rather than the tense confrontation it had been in September, that Eleanor understood something had shifted in the valley's relationship to Carter Ridge. It wasn't dramatic. It was the accumulated weight of small things, the way Ruth Morrison came to her immediately, and not with the social performance of a woman being polite, but with the directness of a woman who had decided she'd found someone worth knowing. The way other women sought her out, ranchers' wives, several of them who had heard the story of the Friday night meeting and the land commissioner's ruling, and were connecting those 2 events to the woman at the center of them. There was a woman named Clara Hutchins, wife of a rancher whose operation sat east of Morrison's, who had been fighting a water rights dispute alone since her husband had died the previous spring. She found Eleanor near the food table and said without preamble, "They say you read survey documents." "I do," Eleanor said. "I have water rights documents going back to 1869, Clara Hutchins said. "I've had 3 lawyers tell me there's no case. I think they're wrong, but I don't know how to prove it." Eleanor looked at her, this woman rangy and work-worn, and carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who has been fighting alone for too long. "Bring me the documents," Eleanor said. "I'll look at them." Clara Hutchins blinked. "You'd do that." "I've had some practice," Eleanor said, "and I know what manufactured legal weakness looks like from the inside." That was the conversation that everything else grew from, not immediately, not all at once, but in the way that things grow when they're rooted in something real. The summer brought the counter-survey confirmation, the full resolution of the Holt situation, and the beginning of what Eleanor would not have known to call anything until Ruth Morrison named it for her in June. Ruth came to Carter Ridge on a Tuesday with Clara Hutchins, and a woman named Agnes Ford, whose family had lost a timber section to a claim similar to Holt's 3 years earlier. And the 3 of them sat at Eleanor's kitchen table and spread out their documents, and Eleanor read them with the focused attention she brought to everything important, and by the end of the afternoon, she had identified 2 significant legal errors in Agnes Ford's original case and a procedural failure in Clara Hutchins' water rights dispute that was almost certainly grounds for reopening. As they were leaving, Ruth Morrison said, "You know what this is?" "What?" Eleanor said. "This is a service," Ruth said. "What you're doing. For women who don't have lawyers they can trust, or money to pay them, or husbands to fight for them." She looked at Eleanor with the direct clarity of a woman who had been thinking about something for a while. "There are more of us than you know." Eleanor looked at the 3 of them. "Then send them here," she said. Nathaniel, who had been in the doorway for the last part of that exchange, said nothing until the women had gone. Then he said, "Eleanor." "I know," she said. "You can't do this out of the kitchen." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "The back room of the ranch office has been storage since I built this place. It's large enough for a proper workspace. If we clear it and put a proper desk in it." "Nathaniel." "Yes. Are you offering me an office?" He looked at her with the expression that was fully open, now that had been open since February, and had not contracted back, as if he had decided that managing himself down to the narrow minimum was a habit he was through with. "I'm offering you whatever you need to do what you do," he said, "which I've decided is my primary job from here on out." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, She thought about a wooden platform in Silver Creek. She thought about 7 rejections and the specific weight of accumulated dismissal. She thought about a man on a horse who had stopped and looked at her like she was something he was genuinely trying to understand. "Clear the back room," she said. "I'll need a desk and 2 chairs and good light." He smiled, the full version, the one she had been collecting since October, and went to clear the room. What grew from Eleanor Carter's back-office workspace over the following year was not something anyone had planned or designed or predicted. It grew the way things grow when they meet a genuine need organically, rapidly, with the specific energy of a vacuum filling. Women came. First the ones Ruth Morrison sent, then women they sent, then women who had heard the name Eleanor Carter from someone who had heard it from someone else. They came with land disputes and water rights conflicts and fraudulent debt claims and the particular legal vulnerabilities that the frontier created for women without male advocates. Eleanor read their documents. She identified what was manufactured and what was legitimate and what was genuinely uncertain. She wrote letters under Prescott's supervision that carried legal weight. She connected women with each other, the one who had survived a water rights fight with the one who was just entering one, the one who knew the county recorder's habits with the one who needed to file before the session deadline. Nathaniel funded it without being asked, which Eleanor appreciated in the specific way she appreciated everything he did that was concrete and action-based. Rather than performed, he simply made the resources available and got out of the way and let her work. Prescott, when he came up from Helena in the fall to handle the final paperwork on the Holt situation, spent 2 hours in Eleanor's back office reviewing what she'd built, and came out looking like a man who had reassessed something fundamental. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "have you considered formal training?" "In law," Eleanor said. "In law." "I'm 35 years old," she said. "The first women's law program in the territory is opening in Helena next year," Prescott said. "I'm on the advisory board. I would write you a letter of recommendation myself based on what I've seen you do in the past year." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about this carefully, the way she thought about everything that mattered. "I'll consider it," she said. She told Nathaniel that evening. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do it. It's a year in Helena, possibly 2. I know what a law program is. The ranch, Eleanor." He looked at her with the steady, direct expression of a man who had thought something through and arrived at a position he was committed to. "The ranch ran for 6 years without you. It can manage a year in your absence. What it cannot manage, what I cannot manage, is being the reason you don't do the thing you're clearly built to do." She looked at him. "You'd be alone up here through another winter," she said. "I've been alone through worse winters," he said. "And I'll come down to Helena when I can, and you'll come home when the sessions end." He held her gaze. "This is not a negotiation, Eleanor. This is me telling you that your life is not smaller than this ranch, and it never was, and I will not let it become so." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. She thought about the woman she had been on the platform in Silver Creek, the one who had pre-accepted rejection to protect herself from the full weight of it. The one who had rationed hope the way you ration a supply that you're not certain will be replenished. She thought about what it meant to be loved by someone who expanded your possibilities rather than containing them, who looked at the full size of what you were and said more, not less, more. "I'll write to Prescott tomorrow," she said. "Good," Nathaniel said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture he had made in this kitchen a year ago, over survey documents and a land claim and a situation that had not yet resolved itself, and Eleanor turned her hand over and held his back. Outside, the Montana fall was doing what it always did, arriving with commitment, the cold coming down from the high country with the certainty of things that have no reason to apologize for themselves. Inside Carter Ridge, the fire was steady. The year that followed wrote itself in the register of things that don't announce themselves while they're happening, but that you understand looking back were the shape of a life-changing direction permanently. Eleanor went to Helena in January. She came back for the spring thaw and the supply negotiations and the week of Clay Dawson's wedding to a school teacher from Silver Creek who had been corresponding with him since November, at which celebration Eleanor stood beside Ruth Morrison and felt something she recognized as joy. Not the complicated rationed version she had carried for years, but the clean kind, unguarded, the kind that doesn't require management. She went back to Helena in the fall. She finished the program in 18 months, which Prescott said was the fastest completion on record, and which Eleanor attributed entirely to the fact that she had spent the previous year reading every legal document she could find, and had arrived at the program already conversant with most of what it taught. She came home to Carter Ridge in the spring of 1886 with a certificate and a reputation in the territorial legal community that had, Prescott told her, preceded her. Nathaniel was waiting in the yard when the wagon came down from the pass. He helped her down and held her and said nothing for a while, which was exactly right. Then he said, "How was it?" "Excellent," she said. "I was the oldest student and the best one." "Of course you were," he said with no irony in it whatsoever. She pulled back and looked at him. He had lines around his eyes that had deepened slightly, and his hair had more gray in it than she remembered. And he looked to her specific eye exactly like himself, like the man who had stopped his horse in Silver Creek and looked at a woman on a platform with the genuine attention of someone trying to understand what he was seeing. "You look good," she said. "You look—" He paused, which was not his habit. "You look exactly like someone who knows exactly what she is." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about 7 platforms. She thought about the specific cruel arithmetic of being passed over in public again and again by men who made their assessment in seconds and were wrong in ways they would never know they were wrong. She thought about the weight of accumulated dismissal and the discipline required to survive it without letting it become the story you told about yourself. She thought about a man who had looked at her differently, not with charity, not with the specific condescension of a man doing a woman a favor, with honest, practical attention, and beneath that something that had grown into the most real thing in her life. She thought about what it meant that she was standing here, a woman with a law certificate and an office, and a community of people who sought her out because she was the one who could see what others missed. A woman who had come to a ranch as a trial arrangement and had become the reason the ranch was what it was. A woman who had been passed over 7 times and had refused each time to let someone else's failure of vision become the definition of her own life. She had known standing on that 7th platform that the right person had simply not yet been in the room. She had been correct. "Let's go inside," she said. "I want to see the back office. I have 3 cases coming in from Prescott next week, and I need to look at the files." Nathaniel laughed, the full, genuine version she had been collecting since the first time she heard it, and picked up her bag and walked with her toward the house. Clay Dawson, who happened to be crossing the yard, tipped his hat at her without breaking stride. Pete appeared briefly in the kitchen doorway, assessed that the situation was exactly what it should be, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. Will Ferris, up on the fence line, raised one hand in a wave that contained more than a wave usually contains. Carter Ridge received Eleanor Carter. The way a place receives someone, it has grown around. Not with fanfare, not with the dramatic architecture of a reunion, but with the settled ease of something returning to its right position. She walked through the door of her home. She stood in the kitchen that she had reorganized in the first week that had seen fire and crisis, and 25 men fed through a Montana winter, and 100 ordinary mornings that had built a life. She put her hand on the kitchen table, and she thought clearly and without complication the same thing she had thought standing in a yard in September of 1884, when she had first arrived and felt the shape of this place against the shape of who she was. "I am home. Eleanor Whitmore." Carter, the woman. 7 men had looked at on 7 platforms and walked away from the woman. Silver Creek had whispered about and dismissed the woman Gerald Holt had underestimated at every single turn, became the most sought-after legal advocate in the Montana Territory for women's property rights. She did not accomplish this because life had been kind to her. She accomplished it because she had never not once allowed someone else's limited vision to set the boundaries of her own. The 8th platform had not been a platform at all. It had been a man on a horse who knew how to stop and look. And the woman everyone had ignored became the woman Montana could not afford to forget.